Chapter 11. Illuminated by a clear ray from the true light which shone into this holy soul, she spoke admirable things concerning purity of conscience, saying, "Purity of conscience can endure nothing but God alone, for he alone is spotless, simple, pure. Of all things else, that is, of what is evil, it cannot endure even the smallest spark. This can neither be understood nor appreciated, if it be not felt." Hence she had ever in her mouth, as a habit, the word purity. She had also a cleanliness and purity almost admirable in her speech. She wished that every conception and emotion of the mind should issue from it undefiled and pure, without the least complexity. Thus it was impossible for her to feign a sympathy she did not feel, or to condole with others out of friendship, except so far as she really corresponded with them in her heart. The continual humility, contempt, and hatred of self in this soul were at this time most remarkable. When, by the divine permission, she suffered such mental distress that she could scarcely open her mouth, she would then say, "O love, let me remain thus, that I may be submissive, for otherwise it would be impossible that I should not do something wrong. Oh, how good and admirable is the knowledge of a soul, which, being all protected, united, and transformed in God, her felicity sees clearly on one side, her own inclination to all that is evil, and on the other, how she is restrained by God, that she may not commit actual sin. One thing is certain, namely, that never is the soul so perfect that it does not need the continual help of God, even though it be transformed in Him. It is true that the nature of the sweet God is such that He never allows these souls to fall, although the soul, left to herself, could fall if she were not thus restrained. But He only preserves those who never with their free will consent unto sin, and allows those to fall who do voluntarily yield assent thereto. For truly, having given us free will, He will not force it. Consequently, those who fall into sin do so by their own fault, and not by that of God, who is ever ready to aid the soul even after her fall, if she will allow herself to be aided, and will correspond to the divine grace which never ceases to call her, saying, "Turn from evil and do good, and be converted to me with your whole heart." And therefore she said, if the soul, fallen into what sins soever, corresponds to the grace of God and abhors her past sins, with a resolution and a will to sin no more, He immediately frees her from her guilt, and holds her so that she may not fall, nor through her own malice be separated from Him, that is, from the observance of His commandments which are His will. To sin voluntarily is to be separated from God. And not only is He ready on His own part to do all this, but I see clearly with the interior eye that the sweet God loves with a pure love the creature that He has created, and has a hatred for nothing but sin, which is more opposed to Him than can be thought or imagined. I say, God loves His creature with a perfection that cannot be understood, nor could it be even by an angelic intellect, which would fail to comprehend even its slightest spark. And if God wished to make a soul understand, it would be necessary to give her an immortal body, since by nature it could never endure the knowledge. For it is impossible that God and sin, however slight, should remain together, for such an impediment would prevent the soul from attaining to His glory. And as a little thing that thou hast in thine eye will not allow thee to see the sun, and as it is possible to compare the difference between God and the sun to that between the intellectual vision and that of the bodily eye, it is plain that the great opposition between the one and the other can never be truly imagined. Wherefore, it is necessary that the soul which desires to be preserved from sin in this life and to glorify God in the other, should be spotless, pure, and simple, and not voluntarily retain a single thing which is not purged by contrition, confession, and satisfaction, because all our works are imperfect and defective. Whence, if I consider and observe clearly with the interior eye, I see that I ought to live entirely detached from self. Love has wished me to understand this, and in a manner I do understand it, so that I could not possibly be deceived. and for my part I have so abandoned myself that I cannot regard it only as a demon, or worse, if I may say so. After God has given a soul the light in which she perceives the truth that she cannot even will, and much less work, apart from Him, without always soiling and making turbulent the clear waters of His grace, then she sacrifices all to Him, and He takes possession of His creature, and both inwardly and outwardly occupies her with Himself, so that she can do nothing but as her sweet love wills. Then the soul, by reason of its union with God, contradicts Him in nothing, nor does aught but what is pure, upright, gentle, sweet, and delightful, because God allows nothing to molest it. And these are the works which please the Lord our God. Chapter 12. I see that the sweet God is so solicitous for the welfare of the soul, that no human being could have a like anxiety to gain the whole world, even if he were certain to obtain it by his own efforts, when behold the love He displays in providing us with all possible aids to lead us into heaven. I am, as it were, forced to say that this sweet Master appears as if He were our servant. If man could see the care which God takes of a soul, nothing more would be necessary to amaze and confound him than to consider that this glorious God, in whom all things have their being, should have so great a providence over His creatures. Yet we, to whom it is a matter either of salvation or damnation, hold it in light esteem. But alas, how can this be so? If we esteem not that which God esteems, what else should we esteem? O wretched man, where dost thou lose thyself? What dost thou with that time, so precious, of which thou hast such need? What with those goods with which thou shouldst buy paradise? What with thy body, which was given thee to work for and to serve thy soul? What with thy soul, whose end it is to be united to God by love? All these thou hast turned towards earth, which produces a seed, whose fruits thou wilt eat with demons in hell with infinite despair, because, having lost that glory for which thou wert created, and to which so many inspirations called thee, thou wilt then see that thou hast failed to secure it through thine own fault alone. Know for certain that if men understood how terrible is even one solitary sin, they would rather be cast into a heated furnace, and there remain, living both in soul and body, than to support such a sight. And if the sea were all fire, they would cast themselves therein and never leave it, if they were certain of meeting the sin on doing so. To many this will appear a strange saying, but to the saint these things have been shown as in truth they were, and such a comparison seemed to her but a trifling one. She added, "It has happened to me to behold something almost too shameful to relate, and this is that man seems to live quite merrily in sin. It astonishes me that a thing so terrible should receive so little consideration." She said again, "When I see and contemplate what God is, and what our own misery is, and behold the many ways by which He seeks to exalt us, I am transported beyond myself with astonishment. On the part of man, I see such a perversity and rebellion against God, that it seems impossible to bend His will except by the lure of things greater than those he enjoys here in this life. This is because the soul loves visible things, and will not renounce one but with the hope of 4. And even with this hope, she will still seek to escape, if God did not retain her by His exterior and interior graces, without which man, whose instincts are naturally corrupt, could not be saved. For we are naturally corrupt, could not be saved. For we are naturally prone to add actual to original sin, and to continually tend toward earth for our satisfactions. And as Adam opposed his own will to the divine will, so we must seek to have the will of God as our only object, and by it to have our own disposed and annihilated. And as we cannot by ourselves discover our own evil inclinations and our secret self-love, nor possibly annihilate our own self-will, it is very useful to subject our will to that of some other creature, and to do its bidding for the love of God. And the more we so subject ourselves for that divine love, so much the more shall we emancipate ourselves from the evil plague of our self-will, which is so subtle and hidden within us, and works in so many ways, and defends itself by so many pleas that it is like the very demon. What it cannot effect in one way, it does in another, and this under many disguises. Now it is known as charity, now as necessity, justice, perfection, or suffering for God, or seeking for spiritual consolation, or for health, or as a good example to others, or a condescension to those who seek our advantage. It is an abyss, so deep and dangerous that no one but God can save us from it. And as he sees this more clearly than we, he has great compassion for us, and never ceases to send us good inspirations and to seek to liberate us, not by forcing our free will, but rather by disposing us in so many loving ways, that the soul, when she comes to understand the great care which God has taken of her, is forced to exclaim, "O my God, it appears to me that thou hast nothing else to think of but my salvation. What am I that thou shouldst so care for me? Thou art God who thus carest for me, and I am nothing but myself. Can it be possible that I should not esteem what thou esteemest? That I should not remain ever obedient to thy commandments, and attentive to all the gracious inspirations thou sendest me by so many ways?" Chapter 13. I saw, said she, a sight which greatly consoled me. I was shown the living source of goodness in God, as it was when yet alone and unanticipated in by any creature. Then I saw it begin to communicate itself to the creatures, and it did so to the fair company of angels, in order to give them the fruition of its own ineffable glory, demanding no other return from them than that they should recognize themselves as creatures, created by the supreme goodness, and having their being wholly from God, apart from whom all things are reduced to pure nonentity. The same must be said of the soul, which also was created immortal, that it might attain to beatitude. For if there were no immortality, there could be no happiness. And because the angels were incapable of annihilation, therefore when their pride and disobedience robed them in the vesture of sin, God deprived them of that participation in his goodness, which, by his grace, he had ordained to give them. Hence they remain so infernal and terrible that none, even those who are specially enlightened by God, can possibly conceive their degradation. He did not, however, subtract all his mercy from them, for had he done so, they would still be more malicious, and would have a hell as infinitely immense in torture as it is in duration. God also is patient with man, his creature, while he remains in this world, although in sin, supporting him by his goodness, by which we are either tortured, or enabled to endure joyfully all grievous things, accordingly as he wishes to impart more or less to us. Of this goodness we sinners participate in this life, because God knows our flesh, which is the occasion of so much ignorance and weakness, and therefore, while we are in this present life, he bears patiently with us, and allures us to him by hidden communications of his bounty. But, should we die in mortal sin, which God forbid, then he would deprive us of his mercy and leave us to ourselves, yet not altogether so, because in every place he wills that his mercy shall accompany his justice. And were it possible to find a creature which in no degree participated in the divine goodness, it would be almost as bad as God is good. This I say, because God showed me somewhat of his truth, in order that I might know what man is without him, that is, when the soul is found in mortal sin, at that time, it is so monstrous and horrible to behold, that it is impossible to imagine anything equally so. No one need be surprised at this which I say and feel, namely, that I can no longer live in myself, that I am, with a single motion of my own proper will, intellect, or memory. Wherefore, whether I speak, walk, remain quiet, sleep, eat, or do anything else, as if from my own proper self, I do not feel or know it. All these things are so far removed from me, that is, from the interior of my heart, that the distance is like that between heaven and earth. And if any of these things could by any mode enter into me, and give me such an enjoyment as ordinarily they produce, without doubt I should be filled with misery, for I should feel it to be a retrogression from that which had formerly been shown me, and that it ought to have been destroyed. In this manner all my natural inclinations, both of soul and body, are being consumed, and I know it to be necessary that all that is ours should waste away until nothing of it can be found. This is on account of its malignity, which nothing is able to overcome but the infinite goodness of God, and if it be not hidden and consumed, it will never be possible for us to be freed from this goad which is more than infernal, and which, so far as we are concerned, I behold to grow more horrible daily, so that one who was interiorly enlightened, yet had no confidence in God, would be driven to despair by the sight. So dreadful are we when compared to God, who, with great love and solicitude, continually seeks to aid us. It was still further shown to her in spirit how all the works of men, especially those which are spiritual, without the aid of supernatural grace, remain near God, without fruit, and are of little or no value. She saw also that God never fails to knock at the heart of man in order to enter therein and justify his works, and that none can ever complain that he was not called, for God is ever knocking, and not more at the hearts of the good than at those of the evil. Chapter 14. And continuing her discourse, she said, I have always seen, and I am ever seeing more and more clearly, that there is no good except in God, and that all lesser goods which can be found are such only by participation. But pure and simple love cannot desire to receive from God anything, however good it may be, which is merely a good of participation, because God wishes it to be as pure, great, and simple as He is Himself. And if the least thing were wanting to this perfection, love could not be contented, but would suffer as if in hell. And therefore I say that I cannot desire any created love, that is, love which can be felt, enjoyed, or understood. I do not wish love that can pass through the intellect, memory, or will, because pure love passes all these things and transcends them. She also said, I shall never rest until I am hidden and enclosed in that divine heart, wherein all created forms are lost, and so lost, remain thereafter all divine. Nothing else can satisfy true, pure, and simple love. Therefore I have resolved so long as I live to say always to the world that it may do with my exterior as it wills, but my interior, this cannot be allowed, because it cannot. It will not occupy itself except in God, nor could it possibly wish to do otherwise, for He has locked it up within Himself, and will discover it to no one. Knowing that with all His power He is continually striving to annihilate this humanity, His creature, both inwardly and outwardly, in order that when it is entirely destroyed, the soul may issue with Him from the body, and thus united ascend to heaven. In my soul, therefore, I can see no one but God, since I suffer no one else to enter there, and myself less than any other, because I am my own worst enemy. If, however, it happens to be necessary to speak of myself, I do so on account of the world, which would not understand me should I name myself otherwise than as men are named. Yet inwardly I say, myself is God, nor is any other self known to me except my God. And likewise when I speak of being, I say, all things which are being have it from the essence of God by His participation. But pure love cannot stop to contemplate this general participation coming from God, nor to consider whether in itself, considered as a creature, it receives it in the same way as do the other creatures which more or less participate with God. Pure love cannot endure such comparison. On the contrary, it exclaims with great impetus of love, my being is God, not by participation only, but by true transformation and annihilation of my proper self. Now take example. The elements are not capable of transformation, for it is their nature to remain fixed. And because this is the law of their being, they have not free will, and it is impossible for them to vary from their original state. But everyone who desires to remain firm in his own mind must have God as his chief end, who arrests every creature at that end for which he has created it. Otherwise it would be impossible to detain it. It is insatiable until it has reached the true center, which is God himself. Now, although man is created for the possession of happiness, yet having deviated from his true end, his nature has become deformed, and is entirely repugnant to true beatitude. And on this account we are forced to submit to God, this depraved nature of ours, which fills our understanding with so many occupations, and causes us to deviate from the true path, in order that he may entirely consume it, until nothing remains there but himself. Otherwise, the soul could never attain stability nor repose, for she was created for no other end. Therefore, whenever God can do so, he attracts the free will of man by sweet allurements, and afterwards disposes it in such a manner that all things may conduce to the annihilation of man's proper being. So that in God is my being, my me, my strength, my beatitude, my good, and my delight. I say mine at present, because it is not possible to speak otherwise. But I do not mean by it any such thing as me or mine, or delight or good, or strength or stability, or beatitude. Nor could I possibly turn my eyes to behold such things in heaven and in earth, and if, notwithstanding, I sometimes use words which may have the likeness of humility and of spirituality, in my interior I do not understand them, I do not feel them. In truth, it astonishes me that I speak at all, or use words so far removed from the truth and from that which I feel. I see clearly that man in this world deceives himself by admiring and esteeming things which are not, and neither sees nor esteems the things which are. Listen to what Fra Jacopo says about this in one of his lauds. This one which commences, "O love of poverty," he says, "what appears to thee is not, so great is that which is. Pride is in heaven, humility condemns itself." He says, "What appears," that is, all things visible and created are not and have no true being in themselves. So great is that which is, namely God, in whom is all true being. Pride is in heaven, that is, the true greatness is in heaven and not on earth. Humility condemns itself, that is, the affections placed on things created which are humble and vile, not having in themselves any true being. But let us consider more attentively this matter, namely this human blindness, which takes white for black, and holds pride for humility, and humility for pride, and from which springs the perverse judgment, which is the cause of all confusion. Let us see what pride may be. I say, according to what I see with the interior eye, pride is nothing else but an elevation of the mind to things which surpass man and are above his dignity. And whenever man abandons that which is, and which knows, and which is powerful, for that in truth has neither existence, knowledge, nor power, this is not pride. This degrades him, and it generates that pride accompanied by presumption, self-esteem, and arrogance, which occasions so many sins against charity for the neighbor, for man believes himself to be such as he appears in his disordered mind, which is so full of miseries. Therefore God says to this proud man, "If thou seekest, according to the nature of the created soul, for such things as seem at present to be good, and for that happiness which belongs to earth, know that they are not, they cannot satisfy nor afford contentment. Seek rather in heaven, where pride is lawful, and where it is not placed in things empty and vain, but in things which are really great, which always remain, and which cause a sinless pride. But if thou seekest after worthless things, thou shalt never find them, and shalt lost those which thou shouldest have sought." If man's eyes were pure, he would see clearly that things which pass away so quickly as do those things which in this world are esteemed beautiful, good, and useful, could not truly be said to be so, such words being suitable only for things which have no end. Hence man, if he prides himself upon temporal things, becomes unable to attain those that are celestial and eternal, degrades into a vile and humble creature, whose greatness is lost, and who is degraded to the condition of the things he has always sought. Think, alas, what will become of this spirit so generous, created for the highest dignity and felicity, when it is immersed in the vile filth of his own depraved desires, and held by his own demerits in abominations which will ever grow worse, but which will never end, and which have no remedy? Alas, what pain, what anguish, and what desperate tears shall then be to this poor soul! We see and know by experience that only two causes could enable the spirit to remain in a place of torture. One of these is force, and the other the hope of a great reward for such endurance. What despair then will not man suffer when the force which detains him in hell shall never cease, and the pain shall have no remuneration? It is certain that our spirit was created for love and for felicity, and this is what it is constantly seeking in all things. It can never find satiety in temporal things, and yet is ever hoping that it may there attain it. Finally, it deceives itself and loses that time which is so precious, and which was given it that it might seek God, the supreme good, in whom may be found the true love and the holy satisfaction, which should be its true satiety and full repose. But what will it do in the end, when, having lost all its occupations, and discovered all its illusions and its vain hopes, and lost all its time, it remains deprived of every good, and, though contrary to its nature, must forever remain forcibly deprived of all love and felicity? This one thing is so painful and terrible to contemplate, that to speak of it makes me tremble with fear. By this I comprehend what hell and heaven may be, because, as I see that man by love becomes one with God, in whom he finds all happiness, so on the contrary I see that, deprived of love, he remains as full of woes as he would of joys, and that is infinitely, if he had not been so mad. Therefore, although we hear it said that hell is a great punishment, yet this does not appear to me to express it, nor can its gravity be truly told or comprehended, neither could it be represented to one as I understand it. Only by the greatness of love, the true and omnipotent God, can that which is opposed to it be measured. When I consider the blindness of those who, for the sake of things so vile and little, allow themselves to be stupidly led away into the abyss of such horrible and infinite woe, all that is within me is moved by great compassion. In this connection, I recall a possessed person who was forced by a religious to declare who he was. He cried out with great force, "I am that wretch who is deprived of love." He said this with a voice so piteous and penetrating that inwardly I was filled with pity, especially when I was hearing those words, "deprived of love." Chapter 15. I see clearly, said our saint, that when pure love sees even the least imperfection in man, if the mercy of God did not sustain it, it would grind into powder not only the body, but even the soul itself, were it not immortal, knowing that so long as it is retained, he must be deprived of love. I see that the cause of all these evils is that we are so blinded by the enormity of our sins that it is impossible to comprehend, as we should, the extremity of our misery, which is yet supremely necessary for us to know. When man is reduced to his last agony, and in that hour all joys flee from him, and all evils present themselves without a remedy, I cannot find words to express the great pain and anguish which will then overwhelm his soul, and therefore I am silent. O unhappy man! In that hour wilt see how much more solicitous God has been for thy salvation than thou hast been thyself. Then thy whole life will pass before thine eyes, with all its opportunities for well-doing and all its rejected inspirations, and in one instant thou wilt clearly see the whole. Believest thou that thy soul must still live when it passes from such injustice into the presence of true justice? It is not possible for me to dwell upon this thought, for I find it so painful. I am constrained to cry out, Beware, beware! For the matter is of such infinite importance. If I thought I should be understood, I would never say aught else. When I see men die as the beasts die, without fear, without light, without grace, and know how serious a thing this is, I should suffer for my neighbor the greatest pains that I could ever feel, if God did not sustain me. And when I hear it said that God is good and he will pardon us, and then see that men cease not from evil doing, oh, how it grieves me! The infinite goodness with which God communicates with us, sinners as we are, should constantly make us love and serve him better, but we, on the contrary, instead of seeing in his goodness an obligation to please him, convert it into an excuse for sin, which will of a certainty lead in the end to our deeper condemnation. I see that God, so long as man remains in this life, uses all the ways of mercy for his salvation, and gives him all the graces necessary to that end, like a benignant and most clement Father, who knows only how to do us good. And especially he does so in enduring our sins, which in his sight are so very great, that if unsustained by his goodness, man would be ground into powder by them. But man does not comprehend this, and God graciously awaits and bears with him until his death. Then he resorts to justice, although not even then is it unmixed with mercy, since in hell man does not suffer according to his deserts. Yet woe be to him who falls therein, for truly he suffers greatly. And when I see man fix his affections on creatures, even as he sometimes does, on a dog or a cat, or any other created thing, delighting greatly in it, doing all that he can to serve it, unable to admit into his heart any other love, and, as it were, breathing by it, I long to exterminate these things which hold him thus employed, and cause him to lose the great reward of the love of God, which alone can satisfy and make him happy. Alas, this one word I will say about the just and holy ordinance of God, although I know not whether it will be understood. God has ordained man for beatitude, and that with more love than can possibly be conceived. And all proper means to this result he gives him with infinite charity, perfection, and purity, so that man does not lose the least atom that is justly his. And, notwithstanding how many sins he may have committed, God never ceased to send him all needful inspirations, admonitions, and chastisements to lead him to that degree of happiness for which he created him with such heartfelt love. And he does this in such a way that when man shall behold it after his death, he will well understand that he never suffered himself to be led by the divine goodness, and that he has lost God solely through his own fault. Then the opposition he has made to such divine goodness will torture him more than hell itself, because all the pains of hell, however great they may be, are as nothing in comparison to the privation of the beatific vision which is caused by our own resistance. This is proved by divine love, which says that it esteems the smallest imperfection a greater evil than any hell can be imagined. What then shall be said of that soul, which in all things finds itself opposed to the divine ordinations, except that infinite woe awaits it, infinite tribulations, dolors, and afflictions, without remedy, without consolation, and without end, and that it shall be plunged into profound humiliation and infernal gloom. Chapter 16. So great was the humility of this holy soul that she saw her own nothingness most clearly, and would never speak of herself, neither well nor ill. She said, "As to evil, I know well that is all my own, the good I could not possibly do of myself, for nothing can produce something." Nor would she speak, as is customary, of being wicked, lest her lower nature might grow confident and presume upon the knowledge of its incapacity for good, and having such an opinion of herself, Instead of desiring the esteem of others, she cut away even the root of presumption, saying, I will never say anything about myself, either good or bad, lest I should come to esteem myself of some importance. And when I have sometimes heard myself spoken of by others, especially if I were praised, I have said inwardly, if you knew what I am within, you would not speak thus. And then, turning to myself, I say, when thou hearest thyself named, or listenest to words which perhaps may seem to praise thee, know that they are not spoken of what is thine, for the only virtue and glory thou hast belong to God, and thou hast at least in thine earthly and carnal nature no more conformity with good than has the demon. But when evil is spoken of thee, remember that all could not be said which is in reality true. Thou art unworthy even to be called worthless, because to speak of thee at all lends thee a fictitious value. Hence, knowing herself, all the confidence of this great soul was in God, in whom she was so grounded and established, that it was hardly to be called faith, for she saw herself more secure in the hands of God, her love, than if she were actually in possession of all the goods and felicities which it is possible to desire or to think of having in this world, and having placed all her trust in God, and given him full control of her, she covered herself under the mantle of his providential care. She became such an enemy to herself that nothing but necessity ever caused her to speak of herself at all, and she would never do so in particular but would generally say us, and she said, the evil nature of man is pleased with being mentioned, and the greatest blow that can be given is never to speak of it at all, and never make it of any account. Therefore do not willingly name it in any manner. And to her own nature she said, I know thee and rate thee as thou deservest. Thou canst not advocate thy cause with me. And if an angel had come to speak a word in favor of herself, she would not have believed him, so certain was she of her own malignity. And, having this clear knowledge of herself, she was constrained by it to accept with resignation whatever might befall either her body or her soul, so that whenever she found in herself any defect or any pain, she would say quickly, these things are caused solely by my own evil nature, and of this I am so certain, that I know not how I could produce other fruits than these, which are so hateful. I never could do so if God did not assist me. But I know well, having been shown by God the imperfections and malignity of our own inclination, that we can never, except by the help of divine grace, do anything but evil. Good is as hopeless to us as to the demons, and even more so, for, unlike them, we have a body and a free will, which ally themselves to our depravity and do all the evil they can, which is more or less accordingly as God abandons us to our control. But for one who desires to approach God, it is necessary to become the enemy of his enemies, and as I find nothing that is worse than myself, nor that is more inimical to him, I am compelled to hold myself in more aversion than anything else whatever, and will even despise myself and count it to be worthless. And, on the other hand, I will detach my spirit from all the goods of both this world and the other, which I will henceforth regard as if they had no existence. I have implored God neither to suffer me to rejoice interiorly, or to grieve over any created thing, so that I may never be seen to shed a single tear. And I have begged him to take away from me the freedom of my will, so that I may no longer do what pleases me, but only what is according to his pleasure. All these things I have obtained from his clemency. Now, having seen me thus determined, myself said to me, grant me, at least, the consolation of not hearing myself thus spoken of, for, whatever I am, it is necessary that I should exist in some manner. There is no creature which is not suitably provided for according to its needs, and I also am one of God's creatures. Then the Spirit rose up and answered, Thou art indeed a creature of God, but thou art not according to God. And if thou wishest to be so, thou must first be despoiled of all thou hast previously acquired, first by original sin, and afterwards by the actual sins which thou hast freely multiplied, and which are more odious in the sight of God, than thou couldst believe were it told thee. And when I see thee more covered with secret sins than a cat is with hairs, I know not where thou findest courage to say that thou art of God. If I were so mad as to feed thee according to thy inclinations, which are so corrupt and contrary to the purity which God requires, I should do two evil and perilous things. One is that I should never satisfy thee, and the other, that thou wouldst every day grow stronger and wound me more and more acutely. And as I am myself full of evil, thou wouldst attack me secretly and in an apparently spiritual manner, and then no one but God could overcome thee. Speak to me no more of thy crafty designs, for I have determined to disregard thee. Recommend thyself to God, that he may aid thee, and I also will assist thee by his help. Moreover, I will pray him to consume all thy perverse inclinations, and to restore thee again to that primitive innocence in which he created thee, for otherwise thou canst never be satisfied. No one can satiate thee but he who created thee, and who alone knows all thy secret desires, and can grant them without difficulty. Cease, then, to seek for other satisfactions, for however abundant may be thy possessions, thou wilt still remain poor and in want. When once thou art satisfied, all will be given thee which heaven and earth can afford. Know then that I despise thee, and would rather choose to be condemned to hell without thee, than to possess God through thy means. For a pure mind cannot suffer anything to come between itself and God, for it desires to possess him entirely, and to be as pure and simple as he is himself. And this being so, how could it endure to be assisted by thee who art so hideous, and who would always glorify thyself unworthily over thy achievements? And although I know that such a thing could never be, it fills me with indignation to find that I have even imagined it, or that any mind should ever conceive it possible. Thus scorned, myself knew not what to answer, and never more had courage to assert itself. It no longer looked either at the body or the soul, toward heaven or toward earth, but I saw it remained always by itself with all its malicious inclinations, and had God permitted it, it would have done more evil against him than Lucifer himself. Yet as I saw that God continually restrained it, this sight gave me no uneasiness, nor did it ever cause me any torment or suffering. Rather was the effect directly contrary, for he who loves justice is rejoiced when robbers are punished, and surely he who, being evil by nature, desires to become good by his own efforts, is a robber worthy to be punished in hell fire. Hence, when I saw its malignant inclinations entirely subjected to God, and by him executed and annihilated, I was greatly contented, and the more clearly I saw my own proper wickedness, so much the greater pleasure did I take in his justice. And truly, it appears to me that if I could fear anything, it would be my own self, which is utterly evil. Yet when I saw it in the hands of God, I abandoned it to him with confidence, and never since then have I felt any fear concerning it. Rather, I may say, that I never think about it and make no more account of it than if it in no way concerned me. I saw others weeping over their perversities and their evil desires, and forcing themselves to resist them. Yet the more they strove to remedy their defects, the more often did they fall. And when any one spoke of this to me, I answered, "You have woes and you weep over them, and I have them and I do not weep. You do evil and you lament, and I should do the same if the Almighty God did not assist me. You cannot defend yourself, nor can I do so either. Hence it is necessary that we should yield ourselves to him who only can deliver us from evil, and he will do for us what is wholly beyond our power. And in this way we shall find rest from this, our evil self, which is always torturing itself to its own destruction, yet when it is imprisoned by God, it remains submissive and in silence." Chapter 17. This holy woman said that when God disposes a soul to correspond to him with her free will, by placing herself wholly in his hands, he leads her to every perfection. Thus has he dealt with one who, after she was thus called, never more followed her own will, but always stood waiting interiorly upon the will of God, which she so confidently felt to be impressed upon her mind that she sometimes said to him, "In all that I think, speak, or do, I trust in thee that thou wilt not permit me to offend thee." The following rule with regard to the intellect was given to this soul, namely, never to attempt to understand anything in heaven or on earth and, least of all, the spiritual operations in herself, and she obeyed so implicitly that she never more observed curiously anything in herself or in others. If it were asked in what manner the intellectual powers were employed, I should answer that all the powers of the soul were always under the command and in the service of God, and when anything had to be done, at that instant, and in so far as necessity required, it was given her to know what she should do, and then the door was closed. Of the memory she could give no account, for it seemed as if she were without memory and without intellect. This was not caused by any voluntary act of hers, but was the result of seeing herself so often and so suddenly moved to action, that she easily comprehended that it was God who was operating in her, and she remained occupied in him, and lost to all sense of time or place, and without the will or the ability to do otherwise, except when God suddenly effected some change in her. Nor was she ever able to consider anything except what God at the moment proposed to her. In this manner she was attentive to whatever she was doing so long as necessity required, but when it was finished, all memory of it passed with it. The same thing was true of her affections, which were taken from her by her love even at the beginning, and in such a way that she could no longer love anything created or uncreated, not even God himself, at least as he was revealed in those sentiments, in visions, delights, and spiritual correspondences, which all others who beheld them estimated so highly, but which she on the contrary held in horror and sought to fly from. But the more she sought to avoid them, the more were they given to her, and they increased in such a manner that her body was often entirely prostrated by them. Her soul, however, remained pure and serene, as if it were passed beyond such violence, and were filled with divine sweetness. And when this was over, she seemed to be improved both in mind and body. Yet she had no desire for such improvement, and sought for nothing but God, her love, in comparison with whom she rejected all, even that which proceeded from him, as being of less value, or indeed as nothing. This integrity of the will she held so cautiously and was always so hidden in God that no illusion, imagination, or inspiration could interpose between them, nor even any truth which was not immediately from him. Therefore, when God took from her the burden and the care of herself, her spirit found itself all light and able to do great things, and the instinct of love which God gave it, when it was thus separated from her proper self, was so swift and great and powerful, that she could satisfy it nowhere but in God. Then God, seeing her so disposed and well prepared, cast down from heaven one end of the cord of his most upright, pure, and holy love, and with it held her so closely occupied in him that she readily understood that she sprang from him and corresponded with him. Yet in all this her humanity had no share, and neither felt, saw, nor understood it. Thus she allowed this clear water to flow descending as from a living fountain, and by means of her love and of her great purity she saw every little defect which to her appeared offensive, and if it had been possible for her to tell the greatest importance of every least impediment to the divine love, even hearts of adamant would have been ground into powder by fear of them. Chapter 18. This holy soul said that she never spoke of these great things to others without its appearing to her afterwards that she had told a lie. So weak were her words in comparison with that which she experienced through her pure and upright love. She said, therefore, "I do not wish a love which may be described as for God, or in God. I cannot see those words, for and in, without their suggesting to me that something may interfere between God and me. And that is what pure and simple love, by reason of its purity and simplicity, is unable to endure. This purity and simplicity is as great as God is, for it is his own." At another time she said that she never felt like speaking of this simplicity and purity of love, as if she had a sensible experience of it, because it is entirely ineffable and above the capacity of man. Yet she had it in such abundance that, whatever might be alleged or even proved to the contrary, she could not understand how it could increase within her. This must be understood to mean that, being always replenished with love, she could neither see nor desire more than that which at any moment held her satisfied. This, however, did not prevent love from continually purifying and cleansing this precious and elect vessel, and from ever increasing and more abundantly filling her. And to prove this, she said, "Every day I felt myself lifted above these trifles, which this pure love, ever harassing itself with those penetrating eyes that behold even those smallest imperfections which to other love appear perfection, was striving to cast out. This work is done by God, and man himself is not aware of it, nor does he see these imperfections. On the contrary, because such a sight would be insupportable to him, God shows him the perfected work as it were without a flaw. Yet God does not cease continually to purify him, although he does it in a way not comprehensible to any intellect. It is written that even the heavens are not pure in the sight of God, by which it must be understood that such purity is not known, except by the help of a supernatural light which, without any assistance from man, works in him after its own pleasure, and even cleanses him more fully until he is entirely pure. And this work God does secretly, because when man yields himself wholly into the hands of God, which without divine grace he is unable even to wish to do, he can then see the enormity of even one trifling imperfection in the sight of God, and afterward, if he could see all those defects in himself which God is daily removing from him, he would be overpowered by his despair. Hence it is that these obstacles are gradually removed without man's cognizance, and God continually operates in us by his sweet goodness so long as we remain in this present life. When the good God calls us in this world, he finds us full of vices and sins, and his first work is to give us the instinct to practice virtue. Then he incites us to desire perfection, and afterwards, by infused grace, he conducts us to the true annihilation, and finally to the true transformation. This is the extraordinary road along which God conducts the soul. But when the soul is thus annihilated and transformed, it no longer works, or speaks, or wills, or feels, or understands, nor has it in itself any knowledge, either of that which is internal or external, which can possibly affect it. And, in all these things, God is its director and guide without the help of any creature. In this state, the soul is in such peace and tranquillity that it seems to her that both soul and body are immersed in a sea of the profoundest peace, from which she would not issue for anything that could happen in this life. She remains immovable, imperturbable, and neither her humanity nor her spirit feels anything except the sweetest peace, of which she is so full that if her flesh, her bones, her nerves were pressed, nothing could issue from them but peace. And all day long she sings softly to herself for joy, saying, "Shall I show thee what God is? No one finds peace apart from him." And as this process goes on, she is every day more profoundly plunged, immersed, and transformed in this peace, so that her humanity is every day more alienated from the world and from all things earthly and natural, and this in such wise that even the body no longer lives upon corporeal food, and yet neither wastes away nor dies. On the contrary, this creature remains in health without using the means which are the cause of health, because it is no longer supported by nature, but by an incomprehensible satiety which overflows into the body. And this is doubtless the reason why such a creature becomes so marvelous in her aspect, and especially in her purified eyes, which are like two ardent stars, enkindled in heaven, so that she appears truly like an angel upon earth. This love is of so generous and excellent a spirit that it disdains to lose its time in anything, however beautiful and precious, except its own purity and splendor, from which issue translucent rays of ardent and inflamed virtue. Thus is she ever occupied, and all things else she esteems as no longer appertaining to her. This work is constantly progressing, and every day the soul understands more clearly that the end for which man was created was truly for love, and to delight himself in this pure and holy love. And therefore when man has, by the assistance of divine grace, arrived at this desired port of pure love, he can afterwards do nothing, even if he wished or tried to force himself to do otherwise, but love and enjoy himself. This grace God gives to man in a manner so admirable and above every human desire or comprehension, that without doubt, being still in this present life, he feels himself to be made a partaker of the beatific glory.